everyone, and welcome to the Paperback Possibility Podcast, episode 2, this time in video.
Ah, yes.
If you're not watching this on YouTube, you are missing out. Or maybe not. It really depends on how you like to listen to your podcasts. If you want to get some really nice eye contact and two people who are sitting way too close together in order to fit into frame, then head over to YouTube, the Paperback Possibility Podcast over there. What did we read this week?
We read
should I
The
say?
Whistling by Rebecca Netley or Netley?
I've been saying Netley
I've
in
been
my
saying
head.
Netley in my head. How's
Well,
it spelled?
Netley.
Yeah, I put an extra A in there, so that's my fault. So Rebecca
Yes,
Netley,
you do.
Rebecca Netley, The Whistling. Your traditional kind of ghost story, really.
Yeah, very traditional ghost story. I've got some mixed feelings on this book, and I think you do too.
Very much so, yeah.
So it's going to be very interesting to see how things happen, how we get on. And if you read it as well, it would be really lovely to hear your thoughts. We'll leave a comment box on Spotify or the comments down below on YouTube, so you can leave your thoughts there as well. I'm excited to get into this one.
Me too, very much.
So, firstly, some thank yous and a bit of housekeeping as well. I want to say thank you to all the listeners from the last part. You've all been wonderful. The fact that you've jumped on this with us.
Absolutely.
We started the podcast and didn't really think it was going to go anywhere. And then we've got you wonderful people who have been listening, following along, subscribing on YouTube as well. And that's just, it means a lot to us.
And Spotify too.
And Spotify.
Yeah.
So thank you very, very much. We also asked who read Quality Land. We had a poll.
We did, yes.
2 votes for yes, 4 votes for no.
Which I thought was quite interesting.
I think that's more people than I actually expected to have read Quality Land.
Yeah.
Because I hadn't heard of this book at all. And I would really love to know if you read it along with us or you've read it before the podcast. I think that would be really interesting.
Or even after you listened to the podcast and got halfway through before the spoiler section and thought, actually, I'm going to go and read this book. I would be quite interested to see who did that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please let us know. That would be amazing. Also, in terms of the comment boxes on Spotify and YouTube, Michael suggested we read The Salvage Crew by, now I'm definitely going to mispronounce this, Yudhanyaya Wijeratne. It's here, look.
Yudhanyaya Wijeratne. No, I think you've nailed it.
I think I said that exactly how it's written.
Yes.
I don't know
that's
about the
phonetic,
pronunciation. Or Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I don't know how to pronounce her last name as well. But I've had a lot of good stuff about Gideon the Ninth.
Yes.
So I definitely...
And you've told me a lot of good stuff that you have heard about
Yeah,
Gideon the
mostly
Ninth.
from Mike.
Yes.
To be fair. Thank you as well for your last comments on the podcast. Particular shout out to the Cash Films, who gave us some insight into Quality Land. Apparently that was Mark Uwe Kling's... He's a big author.
Yeah, massive in Germany.
Massive
apparently.
author in Germany. I hadn't heard of him, but in Germany he's like very, very big. But he's known for a series known as The Kangaroo Chronicles.
Yes, and did we decide if that had been translated or not?
I think it hadn't.
It hadn't, yeah. That's why he's so big. And
Yeah.
Quality Land was one of the first books that had been translated
Yeah.
over. And there was a sequel to Quality Land
Yes.
that has not been translated as of yet. And apparently there is going to be a third book.
Yeah.
Which is quite fascinating. So I'm looking forward to hopefully getting a translation for that, because I'm very interested to see where that universe goes following the events of that story.
Me too. So thank you very, very much to the Cash Films who gave us that little bit of insight there that we didn't know as English speakers from England. Like, we fully live here. No plans to...
No, exactly. No, we don't dive into like German speaking fiction very often, so
Very often.
yeah.
So this month we were looking at the book The Whistling by Rebecca Netley, or Netley, however you'd like to pronounce it, or however she pronounces it is probably the most apt way of saying that.
Yeah.
Which is a typical ghost story. It's not a horror, I would say. It is a ghost story, but there are some horror elements.
Yeah, I disagree with that, but
We'll get into it.
Yeah.
We'll get into it. So, firstly, let me read you the blurb to catch you back up with the book. When Elspeth arrives on a remote Scottish island to become a nanny to a young child, she hopes to bond with her, until she learns that, for reasons no one will explain, Mary has not spoken in months, and the girl's silence is not the only mystery. Hypnotic lullabies drift down empty corridors, strange dolls appear in abandoned rooms, And as the night draws in, darker questions arise. What happened to Mary's late twin, William? Why did their previous nanny disappear so suddenly? And is the whistling Elspeth hears at night just the storm outside? Or is someone coming for her? You came to me at the end of the last podcast with this book and another book, and we chose to read this one.
We did.
Reading the blurb back, in fact, when I was writing that down for the podcast, I was like, oh, okay, so that is how the blurb was. And it's so interesting to see how the book played out because of that.
Absolutely. I think the blurb is really pushing the mystery of the story, and the mystery is the thing that drives it the most. And I do, if we just flag up that point where you said you don't feel like it's a horror, I do feel like you could definitely make an argument that it's much more of a mystery story than it is actually a horror story. But it is interesting hearing that again, particularly with regards to the stuff about William and why Mary is not speaking. That runs through the entire book. And you don't really find out any of that stuff until right at the end.
Yeah, so the book does have a lot of build-up. It's very much a crafted book where it's a long process of finding things out, and it's not very... You don't really have, like, the gratuitous, here's a small mystery, there you go, there's the answer. Here's a small mystery, there you go, there's it. It's like, this is this one thing that is happening with some added bits that you find out late. And if that's not your kind of thing, probably like most stories, ghost stories wouldn't be in that sense. This is not the book for you.
I think my lead point I wanted to come out with is, if you like ghost stories, not if you like particular ghost stories, if you just have like a genre preference for the ghost story, you'll love this. Even though I think we do have a few issues with it, I think if you just like ghost stories and you're just looking for a ghost story, this is a perfectly serviceable and very enjoyable ghost story. And there's everything that you would fundamentally expect to find in a ghost story is in this book. And if you're looking for that particular vibe, it doesn't do anything groundbreaking, but it's not really trying to either. It just hits that particular flavor of fiction right on the head. And you can tell that Rebecca Netley was aiming specifically for that. She had clearly decided, I am going to write a ghost story. And so that's exactly what she did. No bells and whistles. Well, apart from the one whistle that's in the plot. But nothing crazy, nothing out of this world. She just sat down and said, I want to write a ghost story. And that's what happened.
Interestingly enough, this was her debut novel.
Yeah.
It also won...
Which I do think it shows, actually.
You think?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
It also won the Exeter Novel Prize, so that's something to keep in mind as well. We did get some feedback that we should delve into the authors a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
Especially on the last book with Mark Uwe-Killing. One of our listeners, Susie, suggested that we do a little bit more research into the author, which genuinely I tried to do for Rebecca Netley this morning, but she has the same blurb of herself everywhere, which is basically just that she lives in Reading, which is ironic, but that's probably more of a joke for people who are reading the podcast. And she lives there with her family, and this is what it said on Amazon, which I thought was very, very funny. With her family, and apparently, according to Amazon, her over-enthusiastic dog who gives her writing tips.
Oh. Wow. If this book is anything to go by, I would say maybe don't listen to that dog so much.
Oh, whoa. That's savage. And I will say, I've written everything in my notebook, and I wrote her over-enthusiastic good.
Oh, very good. Or very dog, as it would be.
So we've got some good points, we've got some bad points. We're going to go over the book in as little detail as possible, where it still tells you about the book and why you should read it, up until about the halfway point of the podcast. And then, as always, we are going to switch into more spoiler mode. We're going to talk a bit more in depth about it. So if you wanted to sit down, read the book yourself, that would be a good place to pause and come back to it at a later date. I think a lot of you liked that idea, it seemed. We
Yeah,
definitely like that idea.
I really like that idea personally.
But let us know if that is something that you choose to do, because it would be lovely to hear. As Alfie said earlier in the podcast, we didn't introduce ourselves this time round.
I'm Alfie.
I'm Ashleigh. And we started the Paperback Possibility podcast with the sole purpose of picking between two books.
Yep.
And we are going to be... So one of us, it'll be me today, says, hey, Alfie, there's these two books that I would like to read. And then Alfie gets to pick which one we choose.
Yep.
Now, one of them, I think you have chosen before.
Yeah, this is interesting. So we've between the two of us, we've been doing this for a few months. And we've only just started the podcast as like an aside to us doing that.
Yeah.
So obviously there's been a few more options than you guys would have heard. So I'm interested to see.
Yeah.
And but the funny thing is, I'm sure you're going to bring it and be like, you brought this before, and I'm like, I don't remember.
Yeah, I've never heard of this.
I've never heard of this book at all.
Some good points about the whistling.
Yeah.
I thought it was written beautifully.
I agree.
Not necessarily in terms of how the plot worked out or anything like that, but in terms of the stylings, the theme, I think it's set in 1860 or like 1864 or like around the 1860s.
Classic.
And I think that she did a brilliant job of putting us into that time sphere. And I really think that I feel like I was transported back. It was the language. The language was so 1860s.
Yeah.
How you'd expect it to be. Obviously, none of us were here in the 1860s, but from other media, TV, film, that is how I would expect everyone to talk.
Absolutely. Little things like everybody is addressed as a miss or a mister, apart from like very specific characters who are servants, and then they are just known by there's no title. Just little things like that. They talk about like lanterns, how the house is lit. The way that people move around. She often describes the main character has come from the city to this island. She often describes what Edinburgh is like at this time period. So it really does paint the picture very well, I found.
I think there's one point in the book that the language brought me out. I wonder if you can think about what it is, but it's spoiler territory, so we'll put that in the second half. I think that if I didn't know any better, I could say that this was either written in the time or it was a memoir from the time. Like I could definitely get my head around that being like someone's account. I know that sounds really weird considering there is a lot of fantasy or ghost story in this, and there is elements of horror, which I always forget this until we get to this point, but there are elements, for content warning, there are elements of suicide, death, mentions of murder. I don't think there's really anything else. Just horror elements.
Yeah.
Witchcraft.
All of those elements also do involve children as well, so that's something to mention. So that's got all of that, plus children are also involved in that, so that's just something.
But there's not really anything aside of that. It's everything you maybe typically see with a ghost story.
Yeah.
Nothing...
I wouldn't say it's not massively grotesque.
I would agree.
It's not gruesome. There's only a couple of scenes in it that are actually quite visually freaky, but for the majority of it, it's just atmosphere.
I thought another really good point was, I thought that the lore, the witchcraft, I think that was all very believable.
Yeah.
100%. I don't know much about witchcraft. I will say that much, but I fully believed everything. In fact, I went and Googled the widow's whistle.
Oh, did you?
I can't find anything about it.
Oh, okay, so she made it up.
So I think she made it up.
That's very clever.
But it's so... She writes it so well. I would never have thought that was made up. I would have thought that was ingrained in lore. And maybe it is, and maybe my research didn't go deep enough. I'm thinking, Bella in Twilight and how she looks up the Quileutes or however you want to say it. But she has to dive like quite underneath things.
The third or fourth page of Google.
Yeah, at least the fourth page of Google. So maybe it's more like that, and maybe I just didn't do my research deep enough. But from what I saw, there were like whistles that were made of like thigh bones and things like that exist, but I didn't really see anything about a widow's whistle.
Yes.
But also that's because on Google everything that came up was about windows whistling. So maybe that's
Maybe
to do
not.
with what it is. So I thought The Law and the Witchcraft was written very
Yeah,
well.
I agree. I think the way that it is fed through the story. I think this is a book that is best read in large chunks. If you can read it in one go, I
Yeah,
think you'll have a
100%.
much better time with it. If you chip away at it, I think you'll struggle, and we'll get to why that is later. But the way that when the character arrives at Skeltsea, which is the island,
Which is a fictional island as well.
oh, there you go.
Yep.
She has this preconceived notion of like what the world is. It's very traditional, sort of like normal person from the real world coming to this kind of magical, scary place and discovering these things about the island as she goes. But the way that it's slowly fed in through the supernatural occurrences and then through the artifacts that come into that, and then the we find out that that's to do with witchcraft. It all feels very much like on this little remote island in the north of Scotland. It feels very much like this is all part of like the island's atmosphere and part of the island's history, and it would make sense that this doesn't happen in mainland Scotland or mainland United Kingdom. It's just this tiny little island has this very particular way of being, and that really works to its favour in my opinion.
I think that the other thing I found very well was for the people who don't have aphantasia, so sorry to listener Emma in particular, but I found it very easy to see everything in my head. Like, I think it painted a really good mental
Absolutely.
image. I felt like, I can't say this enough, I do have things with the book that I don't love, but I feel strongly like I was there. Like, I could imagine it the atmosphere, the like almost smell the wood.
Yes, but I also think that comes from, for me particularly, who I have read a lot of ghost stories. I've watched a lot of ghost fiction on TV and stuff. There was like a fundamental familiarity with everything that was going on, and I feel like that really helped me get into it. Like immediately when she arrives, like the very first thing that she talks about as she arrives at Skeltsea is the foggy beach. And
Yeah,
then she
yeah.
looks up the hill and there's this big house that's like foreboding and scary. And it's like that's every ghost story that's every ghost story that's ever written. That's Woman in Black, that's Bly Manor, that or Turn of the Screw as it is in book form, or Hill House, or any of that stuff. Like it all feeds into those preconceived notions of what a ghost story is. And so when I opened the book and I started reading, I was like, oh, it's great, because all of the imagination that I usually have to kind of think about, like what does this, I don't need to do any of that because
That's
I already know what this is. And that, for me, I found that so comforting and cozy, because I was like, I already know exactly where I am in this world and I'm very happy about it. But that's not to take away from the fact of how descriptive it is, because it is very descriptive and it's very well descriptive.
Yeah.
Because it does stand Skeltsea and Ilskar, which is the house, do stand alone from those other haunted mansions, I guess, that I mentioned.
It's interesting that you say about the haunting of Bly Manor or
Yeah.
Turn of the Screw, because in my head I did picture it as very similar to the manor that was used in a TV show, The Haunting of Bly Manor.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw the dark wood from that and the wallpaper, and the thing is that I think you're right with cozy.
Yeah.
Weirdly, for a ghost story, I think this was a overall kind of a cozy book.
But for me, this is about as cozy as it gets. I don't think there is a genre of fiction that is cozier than a haunted house story. I think that is perfect, like by the fire, like lights dimmed, quiet, and you just like are fully in it, and like even the smells of the beams of the house, like that all comes through in this kind of fiction, because it's so descriptive as a genre. And personally for me, like this genre is about as cozy as it gets, and I loved it, and I think she nailed that really well.
I think the last thing I've got on my good points list, not saying that this is it, the last thing I've got on my good points list is that it was, beyond everything else, it was easy to read.
Yeah, 100%. Completely agree.
It wasn't a struggle. There weren't I think there were 3 words that I had to Google to make sure I knew the meaning, which I really like in a book where it's not overpowering with hard words, but it's, hey, this is a word that you probably haven't heard of or used in this context before, so you get to learn it, which is really nice.
Absolutely.
I think that the book itself was, I don't know if it was something that I would pick up myself, just off the bat.
Yeah.
I don't think I tend to go for horror or ghost stories.
For me,
but you do.
This is exactly I would pick this up off the shelf and go, oh yeah, this is totally my thing. I'm in, and that's basically why I picked it, to bring to this, because it is so much my area. But yeah, for me, the key strengths: incredibly atmospheric, very well paced. It doesn't meander. It is a slow burn, but that's just nature of the genre, like a ghost mystery. But it has pace. It's not boring. At least I don't think so. And I think it does get where it's going at a nice pace. And even when it is slowing down, just being there was enough for me to enjoy reading it. I just loved just being in that atmosphere and soaking in that tone as much as I could, which is why, as I say, I think it is best read in large chunks. I think I started reading it very chip away up until about the first sort of 60 odd pages, and then when I got to that point, I was like, right, I'm just going to sit down and just read this. And I read 150 pages in one sitting, and that was when I was like, oh yeah, I'm actually really enjoying this now. So, yeah,
I do agree. I think I read it in 3 sittings.
Yeah.
With a mini 4th one where I got about 2% of the way in and then fell asleep. But that's not a thing about the book, by the way. I just was very tired. I have got 2 quotes that I want to share.
My favourite part.
My favourite part. My quotes, if you were here for the last podcast, I feel like I pick the weirdest things. I pick strange things that don't necessarily make sense, or things that speak to me. These 2 quotes are things where I read them and I was like, I really like the way the author, Rebecca Netley, I love the way she used the language in this book. So they're not spoilers per se, remembering this is a ghost story, so it's talking a little bit about the atmosphere. But the first one, which is from chapter 14, what is it called? The speaker, the narrator, Elspeth.
Yeah.
The main character.
Yeah. The story is told through first person.
It's first person perspective.
Our main character is also our narrator.
Yes.
And I'd say she's quite a reliable narrator as well. I wouldn't say reliable narrator.
I have arguments for this.
Okay.
But we'll get into that. This quote from chapter 14. I opened my mouth to call, but the words were smothered in a sweat of fear. I thought that was so well written. I'd not heard that
alliterative, thick.
Yeah, it's so visceral.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing I like about this book, is there are so many descriptors that are very visceral.
Yeah.
And you can just feel them. The chapter 18 quote that I yoinked was, when I took Mary to bed, she held onto my hand as if to make me stay, but I was too weary of being awake. And I really liked that. It's so true, though. Sometimes you're just too tired of being awake. You just can't. It's not even being tired for tired's sake. It's just you want it to be done.
Absolutely. And it's got a lot of, I think a sentence like that just also illustrates the rhythm of everything. It has a nice flow to it.
The cadences of most of the sentences, that they are so nice.
Yeah.
And it's so, again, it takes you back to that time.
Yeah, and it's just so pleasant.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
so pleasant to read and to just be and to go through it and to follow the motions. It's just lovely. I really enjoy that aspect of it.
Now, that being said, one of my more negative points is, and I talked to you about this briefly yesterday.
We did, yeah. Because we both finished the book yesterday.
Yeah.
So
I think I started yesterday with 67%, and I was just like, right, I'm going to get up to 70%. Did that. Get up to 80%. Okay, good. 80%, I may as well finish the book at this point.
I think I was on about 75 when I started yesterday, and I was just like, well, I'll just finish it.
Breeze through. One of the things I had issues with was that I felt like some of the sequences of the book were quite repetitive, not necessarily in the sense of the storyline, but in the sense of our character has discovered something, so she tells someone, but we've had the discovery of it and then her telling someone and then it's retold again in a different way.
Yeah.
So I do find I think it maybe happened twice. I don't think it was necessarily too repetitive, but it bothered me, as this is where it ties into what you were saying earlier, as someone who does read it in bigger chunks. I remember this. It's almost like a recap episode.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
I remember this has just happened, and as you were saying, if you chip away at it, I actually think it does work in your favor.
Yeah.
But it did. I think it happened like within chapters.
Yeah.
So again, it's like if you are someone who reads a book from chapter to chapter to chapter, that might also aggravate you a little bit.
I think this comes into my point that I said at the start when I was like, I can tell that this is her first book. I think there's a lot of almost there's a lot of academic, this is how you write a story in this book. And I like that, because that means that she was able to take the ghost genre, the subgenre of like ghost story, and just make a ghost story. But the problem is a lot of like the structural design, it becomes a little bit like what you're saying, where it's like she'll discover something at the start of the chapter, and at the end of the chapter she's like, and now I have this question about this. What is this? What is this? Will I ever know? Find out in the next chapter. Is a lot of that sort of thing, which is fine, but there's not a lot of nuance in how it's done, and thus it's quite easy to spot. And then for people who, I think, like us, who read a lot of books, it's a bit too obvious, and it can grate a little bit and take you out of it somewhat.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think the thing that I found, which I don't think you agree with, I thought it was very long and slow.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
I think that's maybe something that is quite indicative of a ghost story.
Yeah.
However, for me, someone who, I like it to be fast paced. I like to go from one place to another. And I do think from sort of like 75 to 85%, I think it was that. And I think we went from like place to place to place quite fast.
Rapidly, yeah.
And that was where I was like, I will talk about this more in part 2 or like the second half. But I was so into it, and I was like, yeah, actually, I can see why you like this book. I can see like why you'd want to keep reading it, and I was like quite happy to like rapidly race through that, and I think that's what kept me reading as well. I don't think you thought the same.
No, I see what you're saying, and I think that is something that is a trope of this genre and horror fiction in general, but this kind of horror, there's a lot of books that I've read in the past and a lot of stories that I've watched, or movies, horror movies, things like that, where it's, 80% of it is build up, and it's this kind of like sowing the seed, this atmosphere, and it's just like this slow kind of, you have your little spikes of tension that just kind of ratchet up, but you're just kind of building and building and building and building to the last 100 or so pages when everything just goes crazy. There's this wonderful book that I read a few years ago that is very much like, it's about 500 pages long, and it's called Harvest Home, and it goes for about 400 pages where nothing happens, and then the last 100 pages everything just goes absolutely insane, and it really feels like a very good payoff. The problem with this book, we'll get more into it in spoilers, is there's all that build up, and then the last 50 or so pages, it's really going, but then in the last like 30 pages, the mystery is solved and it kind of falls down because it's not really a satisfying conclusion, which really hurts the rest of the book, because up until those last 30 pages, I was really into it. I was loving it. I personally didn't feel like it was slow because I kind of accepted that as like a genre trope. But those last 30 pages, we get there and I'm like, oh, it didn't quite stick the landing, unfortunately, which does hurt then my view of the rest of the book.
I think we're approaching spoiler territory, but there's one last thing I'd say on my bad points list, which again, I don't think bad points is the right phrasing, but I can't think of any more. So if you have a better suggestion,
well, I think it's fine.
But it's not bad. It's just not to my taste.
Sure.
Not to my taste phrasing. I think I needed a flowchart to map out all of the characters. There
Yeah,
were
this is we both agree
so
on this.
many characters. Alfie and I, when we were sitting there reading it yesterday, were like, do you know who this character is? Or who's this character? Or where did they come in? And I took maybe like a 5-day break from the book, from reading to 67% or whatever it was. And then from yesterday, I'd forgotten who most of them were. But that's even when I was reading it before, I was struggling actively to remember who the characters were.
Absolutely.
When we get to Skelsey, we're introduced to so many different characters very quickly. To be fair, that's because there are a lot of characters who are around. There's a lot of staff in the house. There's a whole town, basically, you get introduced to. However, I struggled to remember that this person was the priest or the pastor or however you say. This was their wife. This was the person who ran the local fishing merchants or something like that.
This person was the cook. This person was the doctor.
Maid,
this person was this person, and it's like the problem is they all come in and out of the story. It's not like Elspeth is like. She sort of is going to these people specifically, but they sort of kind of randomly interchange. She'll just be like, I'm going into town, and I saw this person and this person. Then she'll come back to the house, and then there's this person there. Then she goes back to town, and it's like, it's two different people and one person from the house. So nobody really has like a geographical like place that they are, which makes it quite difficult to actually track which character is which, because she meets a lot of them in the church at the start. And then she comes back to the house, and there's people at the house who are at the church, but then they're never at the house again. They're always in town. And then there's people that she meets at the house, and they're at the town. It's just all a bit like, and the problem with calling everybody by a title, everybody's first name is either Miss or Mrs. And it's like, I have to try and remember the surnames. I think that it's a choice to give everyone a title, but the problem is everybody just becomes a Miss or a Mrs. And I don't know why, but my brain just assumes I really struggle with separating all those characters out. And I also think that the characterizations for most of the characters are a little bit poor, because none of them, apart from a very select few, actually stand out in any way. There's the characters that we hear from the most, and I remember them, but as we'll get into spoilers, there's two characters in the story that Elspeth talks to quite a lot, and for the entire book, I thought they were the same person. And that's not good that I came away with that. And I do not feel that that's a fault on my part. I think that's a fault on how the characters are written.
I will say I do not agree with that, but I think the characters, as someone who has a bad memory, and I try and make such a big effort to remember who all of the characters are from any book I read, because I'm like, I know I will forget who you are. It's hard in this context because I wanted to remember who everyone was, but it's hard to know. Sometimes, like when you read a book, you're like, this person's definitely important. This person is 100% important. This person's important. But it was like, I couldn't tell that person A was someone who I was supposed to grab onto.
No.
And person P wasn't.
That's a very, very good point. Like, you're just thrown loads of names at the start, and I'm like, who of these people do I need to remember? Because I cannot possibly remember them all.
Yeah, exactly.
And then by the time that you're into the book, it's a little bit too late. If you haven't cottoned on who you're supposed to know, then you're going to start to struggle.
Yeah. So, ratings wise, we got to give it a rating, and we got to tell you whether or not we think it's worth you reading.
Yeah. And we've said it's out of 5, but no points.
Yeah, we can't do half points or quarter points or anything like that. I know my number.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, should we say it together, or do you want to go first?
No, we'll do it separately.
Okay.
Yeah, I can go first. I would give this a tentative 3, but I am leaning towards giving it a 2.
Seriously?
Yeah, because atmospherically it's brilliant, and I loved that about it, and I really enjoyed reading it, but the plot and the characterization, not the plot, the ending and the characterizations really bring it down, and that is such a shame for such a brilliantly written, like from a purely writing words perspective, it is fantastic. From a plot design and structure viewpoint, it's not that good, and that's why I say I think you can tell that it's her first book, but I do think it's a very good debut novel.
I don't think I could write a
I could not write this
debut novel that well.
No, I could not. I think she's done brilliantly, but I struggle to give it. I would not give it higher than a 3, and I'm a little bit questioning whether I should even give it that high, because ultimately we read stories for the story, and if the story and if the story if I come away with it and I think, oh, that story's not that good, I struggle to give it higher than a 2, but I'll give it a 3 because it is written so well.
And do you think it's worth reading?
I think it's worth reading if you really love ghost stories and you want to read a ghost story for the sake of reading a ghost story. Definitely worth reading. If you are not that bothered about ghost stories, you are not missing out by skipping this.
I agree that it's a 3, but I think it's a solid 3 because I think the atmosphere carries it a lot for me. It's not necessarily rare that I'm transported with a book, but this one I felt like I was very transported. However, for me, the plot is where it did fall down, not necessarily just the end, but the whole plot.
Sure.
But that, again, I don't know whether that's because I'm not a ghost story person. I don't have that experience with ghost stories. But even so, I feel like I love watching ghost stories. I love watching them. So it should translate at least a little bit into reading. And it didn't. And one of my favourite books of all time is The Secret of Crickley Hall by James Herbert, which is a ghost story. So I don't know. So I'd say it's a solid 3. I would say it's worth reading, and if you haven't read it already and you want to get to the sort of more in depth, it's $1.99 on Kindle at the moment as well.
It's a cheap pickup.
So I think that is worth picking up and reading.
I think it's 370 odd pages.
If that. Oh, one weird thing to note as well is the book starts at like 7%.
And it ends at 94%.
And it ends at 94. Yeah. And I went back to see what the gap was for, and it literally goes 1%, 2%, 7%.
Yeah, at the end of the contents.
So I don't know whether there maybe is like pictures or something or maps.
Oh, I'd love that.
Something like that in the print copy, but in the Kindle edition, there 100% wasn't. And I will say again, as a nice point, if you're buying the print copy, the cover is beautiful. Yeah. It's just a candle on a black background, and I know that sounds boring, but look at the cover, it's beautiful.
It captures it perfectly.
Yeah, 100%. So it's time to move on to spoiler territory.
Yeah, so if you haven't read it, pause the podcast, go read it, then come back, listen to the rest of this.
Now, the whole story is what is in the blurb.
Yeah, that's it.
There's
nothing
else. However, one character dynamic that isn't really talked about in the blurb at all, actually, it isn't talked about at all, is the character of Greer.
Yep.
Greer is a maid that is a maid, right?
She is a maid, yeah, she's a servant. She's like the head servant.
Yeah.
The head of the staff kind of person.
She is the most, how would you describe her? Grumpiest?
Grumpy, mean, stuck in her ways, too old to be let go of because she knows the house too well. It'd be a waste to get rid of her. But at the same time, it's like, you know, she's basically become part of the house because she's been there so long.
I didn't see her as old though.
No, I didn't see her as old, but I did see her as like an old soul. Yeah, I guess.
I understand that. And I definitely agree when you say like she is too old to be let go of the house. Yeah. Like she has been there literally since life. She's like 7 years old. Yeah. She has been at this house. Her mum works there. I think her grandmother might have worked there.
Yes. And then there's a whole other subplot as to why Greer is there, which is that her mother was killed. Yep. By accident or not by accident. I never really figured that out.
She said in the book, so this is, again, we are in spoilers territory now. Greer's mother was teased mercilessly, I believe. It, yes. So she did commit suicide exactly. At the house.
Yeah, because all the other servants like made fun of her. And then I think the head of the house feels guilty and thus allows Greer to continue working there.
And forms quite a close relationship with Greer as well.
Because she feels so bad for her. Which is fair enough, so that's all that stuff. But then that leads Greer into being quite a bitter, angry,
Revengeful
Yeah,
woman as well.
absolutely. Spiteful.
Spiteful.
Definitely somewhat of a jealous person as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was one thing that I don't know if you picked up on this, but I thought there was quite a lot of sapphic undertones. I think that there was maybe something not like necessarily like too soft, but something going on between
Greer and Hetty.
Greer and Hetty.
Yeah.
And also between the owner of the house, which is the ward Mary, and her brother William were looked after by their aunt, who owns the house after their mum passed away.
Yeah.
Miss begins with a G.
Gillies?
Miss Gillies. She and the woman they brought in to be the cook, Mrs. begins with an L.
I don't
This
know.
is the problem.
There's so many people, and they're all like interchangeable, like somewhat old women, and it's like they're all just the same.
I felt like they had a very close relationship as well.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether I was reading too into it or it was wishful thinking.
I think for me, the Greer and Hetty thing, massive. So Hetty is the previous nanny.
Yeah.
Before our character Elspeth comes, and Hetty, at the start of the book, is understood that she's left and abandoned this job to go and live in America. And there is a discussion. I think there's even like an outwardly said moment when Elspeth asks Miss Gillies, "Did Greer and Hetty like have a relationship?" And Miss Gillies said, "Well, they were very close." But yeah, so I think there are undertones throughout the whole thing.
I think that there was a moment with Greer later. We need to sort of get through this relatively rapidly so we don't give away the whole thing, and you can experience it for yourself if you'd like to. But the moment I was talking about earlier, where I was brought out by the language, was that speech that Greer gave near the end of the book after everything happened.
Yep.
Greer was made out to be the sort of scapegoat through the book. So
massively,
she was the bad one. She was the one that had caused all of these things to happen. She was the one that had summoned the ghosts and all of this stuff.
But spoilers again, Greer is the one who is summoning the ghost. But the whole way through the book, and it's so obvious as well.
Yeah,
the whole way through the book, you're like, well, Greer is, at the end of every chapter, it's like, well, Greer is the bad one. Greer is definitely the bad one. As a reader, I'm like, well, Greer can't possibly be the bad one. It's
We've
too
learned
obvious.
too much from media that the person who is constantly being blamed as the bad one can't be.
And that's what I talk about when there's not enough nuance.
Yeah.
It's too obvious, and that's that really hurts the mystery throughout the whole book, because the whole way through I'm like, well, I know it's not Greer. Yeah. I know it's too obvious that she's bad. And by the end, I was actually like, well, maybe it is Greer, and maybe that's the nuance. Maybe there's no undertone. It just was Greer the whole time, but then it comes to be that it's not Greer and it's somebody else, and I was like, oh, that's what I thought. Okay, whatever.
The thing with Greer as well and her character building, it was very much like, not only was our main character Elspeth like, Greer is the bad person, but everyone else was like, oh, don't get on Greer's bad side. Don't get on Greer's bad side. Oh, don't get on Greer's bad side.
You know what you said to Greer? You're going to regret that.
Yeah, you are going to regret that. Yeah. And Greer has, there's moments with Elspeth and Greer as well where Greer does say directly to Elspeth, you're going to regret that.
Yeah. So it's very cartoony in that way.
It's very Scooby-Doo villain.
Yeah, it is.
But I kind of love that, but also it's not my cup of tea, so there's that.
It doesn't quite fit in this story. It's not a campy ghost story, but without the nuance, it kind of ends up coming off a bit like a campy ghost story. And I think that's, again, it's such a shame because she did so well to set it up, but it just didn't quite land. One
of the reviews I saw this morning on Amazon said that it was such a well built out ghost story, and it felt like the last 30% of the book was rushed.
Yeah,
I so understand that.
Completely agree. Yeah.
So get that. The ghost story is playing out. We learn quite early on that there is witchcraft involved, and Mary, the child who is mute, she doesn't speak, she has gone around and like put little stones everywhere, and there are dolls over the house, and the widow's whistle, which is essentially a whistle that's made of bone with like skin and hair,
like a wooden reed.
and so you can blow the whistle. It is something that can be blown, but it's made out of a human, which I think is very grisly.
And I love that.
And I don't
love that stuff.
But that's fine, and it did definitely help set the tone. Elspeth finds the widow's whistle or one of them quite early on.
So the purpose of the whistle is you blow the whistle and it summons the dead. You blow the whistle, and depending on what the whistle is made out of and what other artifacts are around, when you blow the whistle, it kind of opens a gate. This isn't like said, but this is how I imagined it. It kind of opens sort of like a sort of gate to the spirit world, and the ghosts come through. One thing that I did really like, and again, spoiler, that I really, really love, which is just a little detail, is I think it's in Greer's speech at the end where she says the ghosts they don't want to come back, and they're angry that they've been pulled away from their other life in the spirit world back to this world. I loved that. I thought that was a great bit of lore, because it really helped build out this kind of how witchcraft in this story is a bad thing. That's like evil, and there's a lot of speak about evil and badness, and like, you know, and I loved that. I thought that was a really good touch.
The book has quite a religious subtext though.
Massively.
That they are all very much like churchgoers, and the witchcraft is obviously going to be seen as evil, because there's good church going, and then there's evil, which is anything other.
Yeah, and you even look at the time that it's set in. Like,
exactly.
This is peak sort of witch trials time. More so in America at this time, but not so much in this country. But it's definitely around.
We've got, from the beginning of the book, Mary, the ward, the child. She's quite young. I can't remember exactly how old she is, but she's like under 10.
8. I just always imagined.
Maybe about 8. Her brother William has passed away in mysterious circumstances. Her nanny has fled to America.
In further mysterious circumstances.
We learn that's not the case. There's a point that we should talk about in a second, but they're both seen as like inherently evil, and as the book goes on, we learn they are more and more and more evil.
It's like the two of them were like conniving Satanists.
This originally, the widow's whistle and some of the dolls are found in William's bedroom under a floorboard. So that further purports that William is the person who is responsible for a lot of the stuff that's happened.
You're led to believe that Hetty was in fact a witch, and she kind of drew William in. And he became like her sort of like apprentice. Wizard. And and they were kind of in it together doing badness.
Now, the book is split into 3 acts.
Oh yes, that's an interesting thing, isn't it?
I liked that.
I did like that as well.
I thought that was very good. And at the end of Act 1 is where I found the book was probably the most intriguing. Maybe through the whole thing. But I'm going to stop saying spoilers, because we're in the spoilers part of the podcast. By this point, if you're still listening, you're either never going to read the book,
and you don't care,
or you are going to read the book and you don't care. There's so the end of Act 1, the beginning of Act 2, we have Hetty. She, after like the whole first act, she's gone off to America. She met a man. She's gone up. She's got a bit of a reputation of being a bit of a someone who likes to sleep around, flirt with men.
She's a woman
enjoys
of the
life.
world.
She is found washed up on the beach.
And I was like,
shock, horror.
I was like, I know that we both talked about this, and we said, of course, like, she obviously didn't go to America. And like, she obviously, the mysterious circumstances probably aren't that mysterious when you actually think about it. But as soon as it happened, I was like, it was almost like it was a beat that I'd been expecting, but I welcomed it. And I was like, yes, okay, now we're getting into stuff. Like, that was getting interesting, because even though I knew that was coming, I was like, it was almost like I ticked a box for me, and it was like she washed up on the shore and on the rocks, and her body is all like blue and cold.
They
from
did
being
a
in the water.
very good description.
And it's really horrible. And I was like, oh yeah, I love this. This is really cool. It's like watching it when you watch a slasher horror movie and everybody ends up dead. You're like, everyone's going to end up dead, but the expectation and then the fulfillment of that expectation in a satisfying way,
Yeah.
I was well in for.
I think that it was good that Hetty washed up. I think that was good. I expected her to not be dead, but I did expect her to be a witch on the island, controlling the dead.
Yeah.
So I thought that she was going to come back. I knew she was going to come back. I didn't expect it in that way. So I was shocked. I was genuinely shocked by that. Not that she came back, but the way in which she did. But it's made very clear throughout that chapter that she had fallen off the boat.
Yeah.
Like, that was just how it was. Everyone just assumed that she had actually gone to America and fallen off the boat and washed back up on shore. I didn't buy this for a second.
No, me neither.
I don't know if you're meant to, but our narrator was so convincing that that is what it was, and consistently brought it back up in the book as, no, that is what happened.
One thing that I've just thought of as a point, it could be, it's within our narrator's characterization that she is constantly throughout the book trying to convince herself that there are no supernatural things going on.
Yeah,
so the
I agree.
constant repetition of things she's found out and being like, well, I don't get it. I can't understand this. You can make an argument, I think. This is off the cuff. I'm just thinking of this
He's
now.
off the cuff. He's off the cuff, folks.
You can make the argument that all of the repetition, all of the like revisiting of our issues that she's coming out with, you can make the argument that she's doing it to try and convince herself and blind herself to the fact that this is clearly a supernatural occurrence and not something that she can just explain away. So there is, I would say you can have some forgiveness for the constant repetition, but I don't, because it's not that interesting to read. But so that was just an aside point.
Where were we?
I don't know. I just kind of flew off and I've derailed us.
Not necessarily in a bad way.
No.
As the book progresses, we obviously learn more about Hetty and William, and not everything is as it seems. Our main character, Elspeth, she goes to Gull's Cry, which is another property that they own, and she learns a little bit about Miss Gillies and the mother of the children, Evangeline. That's not something we really need to go into because it's not integral.
Not important, really.
But she does find Hetty's suitcase fully packed with all the money that she owns, and we realise at this point
she never left.
She never left. She never
bum.
wanted to leave. She did not obviously fall off the boat. We can come to the conclusion that she was murdered, which is where the audience are then thrown into a little bit of, well, William clearly wasn't evil. Hetty clearly wasn't evil.
Yeah,
there
because
is
they were both
more
murdered.
Evil. So it must be Greer.
Yeah, it has to be Greer because there's nobody else who's evil on the island. Everyone else has just missed somebody, and yeah, and I think. Go on. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to continue with the narrative.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So we've got at this point, Greer is the bad guy. We have all of these little witchy bits, which there is a character on the island called Ailsa who is clearly a witch or into witchcraft enough to know that she is the person we go to be like, hey, what is this?
Yeah.
Hey, tell us more. Hey, is Greer bad? The answer, of course, is yes. But we have that ability to go and speak to Elsa.
Yeah, and it's almost video game like the way that it's just like you go to her and it's all your questions that you might have.
Yeah.
And it's like, what is this I have? What is this that I have?
But
what
it
does
is
this
like
do?
that, and it does read that way.
And it's not bad. Ailsa was one of the characters. There's two characters. There's Ailsa and Bridget. I thought they were the same character the entire way through the book. I thought that because I think the problem with Ailsa is her only characterization is that she just answers all the questions.
Yeah, literally.
But then Bridget is like a friend to Elspeth and like comforts her. But the problem is whenever Elspeth goes to town, she always visits them both. And I just never picked up on the fact that there was like a transition period between the two conversations. And so I would just think she'd go to Ailsa and ask her about the witchcraft stuff. And then Ailsa would also kind of like have her arm around her and be like, I know this is like really weird and disturbing and terrible for you. And I know that you're really upset, but I'm your mate. Don't worry. And it was only in the last 10 pages that I realized that this person was a completely different character. And that really was like, oh, what?
Yeah.
But yeah.
We did get, I think the ending was good. I don't
disagree.
think it was a good payoff.
Oh, I thought it was awful.
but I think it was good. I don't think we should talk too much about the ending because I think we should leave
something for the
that
readers.
for you. But I did really like the way it worked. It basically, without spoiling the ending too much, Mary and Elspeth decided that they were going to sneak away, or Elspeth decided that her and Mary were going to sneak away in the dead of night and go and live in London or something, get
Escape
Mary
together.
and her away from all of the misery that was happening.
And at this point, we know that there is a murderer on the prowl.
Yes,
And it's like, we need to get Mary away because Mary knows about the murder. Elspeth knows about the murder, so they're like the next targets. They need to escape.
Which is why Mary's not speaking.
Yeah, so Mary's not speaking because she believes that if she speaks at all, she'll give something away, and then the murderer will come and get her, basically.
So that's, I actually do like that.
Yeah, I liked that aspect of it.
I think that at this point, if you're gonna read it, definitely go and have a read. We haven't kept like a lot of the details we've kept out of the podcast. That are sort of like the bigger, more intrinsically great things. You disagree, but about the book, like the way it ends. And I just think that you should maybe read it. But
I think for me, struggle to recommend it because the payoff isn't there. Can recommend it to somebody who just wants to read a ghost story for the sake of reading a ghost story.
And I will say as well, I really like the writing, but Greer's speech at the end, it made me laugh.
Yeah, it is quite laughable.
It's very like short sentences. And
here's
expletive is used.
Here's what you thought the book was, but here's what it actually is.
Exactly. And it's just a little bit of, if that paragraph wasn't in there, I think my estimation of the book would have gone up a little bit more as well.
Yeah.
But that is what it is. I don't think it was a bad book. I think, again, 3 out of 10. I think that's fair.
3 out of 10?
3 out of 5, sorry. I think it's fair.
Yeah, I think 3 out of 5. I can't give it a 2. That's way too harsh.
No, I don't think it's worth a 2.
I definitely can't give it a 4.
Yeah.
So I'm giving it a 3, but tentative 3.
Tentative 3. Now, I have 2 choices for you.
I am so excited. This is my favourite part of the podcast.
Favourite part of the podcast. And one of them I think you have told me about before, as we said.
Guarantee, even if I have, I've forgotten it.
But before we go into that, do let us know your thoughts down below or in the comments or on YouTube or wherever, in the Discord. If you're in the Discord for my streams, please let us know what you think, because I want to hear your opinion, like more so than I did about Quality Land. I need to know your opinions about this book. I need to know, and I need to know what you think of Greer's speech as well.
Absolutely. And do let us know, like, if this is your kind of book, because it's very much is my kind of book, what you thought of it, and I find that very interesting. I'm always interested in hearing what horror fans think of horror books and horror fiction. But yes, and even if you're a complete outsider to horror, like, do you feel like this is a good entry point? Do you feel like it's a good book on its own, like, regardless of that aspect? Just let us know. And also what genres you'd like to see. Absolutely. Because we do like to pull from different genres. I like to be like, well, maybe this, maybe this, maybe this. And today I have got 2 different genres for you. Yay! So I've got a mystery book, mystery thriller. Oh, okay. Well, I mentioned this the other day that I really like a good thriller. Mystery, yeah, a good thriller. And the other one I've got is more of I think it's a sapphic love story, but with a twist. So book 1. Oh, sapphic with a twist. Sapphic with a twist. Book 1 is called The Vanishing of Class 3B by Jackie Kabler, or Kabler. I'm not sure. It's Jackie, Jackie Kabler. Yeah, Kabler. I would pronounce that, yeah. What happens when your worst nightmares come true? One spring morning, a bus full of children and their teachers from a Cotswold primary school head off on a much-anticipated day trip. But as night falls and the well-heeled parents... I've never heard that phrase before, well-heeled. What does that mean? I don't know. I haven't Googled it yet. Yeah. But as the night falls and the well-heeled parents, 1 or 2 of them famous, as well as wealthy, wait at the school to collect their weary offspring, it soon becomes clear that something has gone very wrong. The children and their teachers simply do not come back. What's happened doesn't seem possible. How can an entire class of children simply vanish? Okay, yeah. So I'm very interested in that one. Yeah. And the second book, which I have up on Amazon,
It's called Legends and Lattes.
I have heard of this.
I
I don't
think
think
you've-
I've brought this, but I think I've talked to you about it.
Well, then you know what this is about,
Yeah.
okay? This is high fantasy, low stakes with a double shot of coffee.
So good.
After decades of adventuring, Viv the Orc Barbarian is finally hanging up her sword for good. Now she sets her sights on a new dream, for she plans to open the first coffee shop in the city of Thune, even though no one there knows what coffee actually is.
Yeah.
If Viv wants to put the past behind her, she can't go it alone, and help might arrive from unexpected quarters. Yet old rivals and new stand in the way of success, and Thune's shady underbelly could soon make it all too easy for Viv to take up the blade once more. But the true reward of the uncharted path is the travellers you meet along the way. Whether bound by ancient magic, delicious pastries, or a freshly brewed cup, they become something deeper than Viv could ever imagine. And there is a prequel to this, but this is a standalone novel as far as I'm aware.
Well, I think, unfortunately, I want to know what happened to the kids on the bus. But I cannot, in good conscience, say no to Legends and Lattes. I have brought this up. I don't think I brought it as an option, but
We've talked about it. We
talked
definitely
about this
have,
book.
right?
And just the idea of reading this, I'm so excited already. So I'm going to have to go with Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry.
Travis Baldry, yeah. It is $4.99 on the Kindle store at the moment, so if you want to get it picked up yourself, please do. Please read along with us. It's, high fantasy, low stakes, good company.
Perfect. That's like, I'm well in. I'm in. I'm like, I can't even... There's nothing about this that I don't love.
I will say as well, the cover is beautiful.
Yeah, gorgeous.
The cover looks amazing. This is definitely a book I feel like could be picked up.
Yeah.
Like as an actual book. It's gorgeous. And there is a prequel to it as well. So if we do enjoy this one, I think in our own time we'll read the prequel. Yeah. But the thing is, right, that caught me off guard when I was reading this is that is what it is, right? I scrolled down to the bestsellers rank and it's number 12 in lesbian romance and number 13 in lesbian fiction. So I feel like Viv might have a love interest.
Oh, wow.
And I really wanted to pick something. So I had the mystery book, but I wanted to pick something as well that was also like a bit more lighthearted. A bit fun, especially after this one. So I went for this, and that's what we're picking. So just as a recap, the book we are going for next month, which will be March 22nd, which is my dad's birthday, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. So make sure you pick up your copy. We'll leave it linked in our website. We do have a website as well.
We do have a website.
The paperbackpostpod.wordpress.com. We basically don't use it for anything apart from saying what's coming up next and also typing up the entire podcast script.
Yeah, so if you prefer to read transcript of the podcast, that's there available for you as well.
So that's there. It will be linked somewhere on the Spotify, somewhere on the YouTube as well. But thank you so much for listening or watching this podcast.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for picking the last book.
Thank you so much for picking.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for picking the next book, which I'm so excited for. I can't wait.
Let us know if you're planning on reading it. Let us know what else is on your book list at the moment. We'd love to know. So from me, Ashley.
And me, Alfie. We'll see you next month. Thanks so much for listening.
See you next time.
Bye.